Stanley OSUAGWU. It is my pleasure to share this session with you all today. We have 60 minutes together. My only ask is I want us to make this session informative and interactive. So feel free to use the chat to ask questions, feedback. And while I might not be able to see the questions, just kind of like let me know once those questions come in, and we can go from there. So have fun.
You see through the chat room.
Okay, perfect. Have fun and let's enjoy today's session. So today's topic is food defense, right? And you all can see my screen very well, right? Yes, just in the chat, if you can indicate in the chat if you can see my screen, okay? I'm assuming yes. I can't see the chat, Wally.
I can see you. I can see the chat. Okay, chats. Can you see it now? I just sent the chats now.
Okay. No, as a presenter, I still can't, but that's okay. I'll just move forward. Well, if you want to just monitor the chat for me and just kind of give me feedback, I'd appreciate that.
No problem. No problem.
All right. So after 9/11, you know, in the United States, the Bioterrorism Act of 2002 was signed into law on June 12th, 2002. My first question for the group is, okay, now I can see the chat. My first question for the group is, it says 9/11, right? Can someone tell me what year when that 9/11 attack actually happened in the United States? You could populate the chat, that'll be good. Just to make sure everyone's awake. So my question is, what year did that 9/11 event happen in New York City that caused for this act to actually get formed in the United States?
Let's respond, please.
I see a raised hand. Yeah, Christian.
Christian, we cannot hear you.
December 12, 2003.
So John Osemene got it correct. It's 2001. So 2001 was when the World Trade Center got attacked in the United States. That was when the 9/11 attack happened. And what that actually, it sent you know, a lot of security concerns where we identified that we had, you know, the US had a lot of vulnerabilities, right? So with that, Congress acted and enacted the Bioterrorism Act. And the focus of that was a few things, right? The law was established to build a response to ensure that the US is prepared from a bioterrorism attack. And again, not just the US, again, you know, the US being the leader from when it comes to food safety programs and security programs. So that was enacted in 2002 by Congress and then President of the United States. Also, what came out of that also was the formation of the Homeland Security Department in November of 2002. The regulation actually in the United States became effective on December 12, 2003. So who said 2003? That was when the regulation actually became law, and every food processor had to be compliant with that act, right? So what exactly is food defense? So the U.S. government with agencies such as the FDA, the USDA, the Homeland Security, they started using the term food defense. And basically this term was used to describe security efforts needed to protect food supplies from intentional acts of contamination, adulteration, and tampering. Those are key words. Intended to protect food supplies from intentional acts of contamination, adulteration, and tampering. And we'll go through these later on. So again, it's how do you secure your food supply from farm processing all the way to your customers from the product being adulterated, contaminated, or tampered with. So the 2002 Act of the 2002 Act actually, you know, it drove companies to actually shore up their program or reassess the following programs: the management of their food defense, physical security, employees, your computer systems, raw materials and packaging, your operation, and the finished product. Is there a question? Ola, did you have a question? Okay. So those are the main things. Then in 2007, in October 2007, so I think when the act got rolled out, some operations were very compliant, but there were still some gaps in the process. So there was a 5-year reassessment. And then it was reevaluated, right? And when it was reevaluated, there were a few more components that were added, and there was some more expansion to the program. So management of food defense was still there. The human element became a priority, right? Because as you see in the slide, at some point, you would find out the greatest threats to your food defense program is actually internal employees, right? So that had to be expanded upon. Your employees, and also the public, right? Someone intentionally, bypassing your barriers to actually, contaminate or adulterate your process. Your facility security, that includes physical security, your operations, and this included your incoming materials, your computer systems, and your finished products. Fast forward to January 4, 2011, FSMA was born, right? FSMA became this all-encompassing authority that President Obama actually gave to the FDA to regulate how food is grown, how food is harvested, and how food is processed, right? So this is the history of the food defense program. See if I can. Okay. So what are the hazards? Your food defense hazards, right? The food defense hazard analysis must be signed to identify and it mitigates hazard in your food supply that are known or reasonably foreseeable, right? So here's another question for the group. What would be an example of a known hazard in your food defense program? Understand that the definition of known means a hazard that's known to be present. It could be biological, physical, or chemical.
So physical could be like glass.
Foreign material, that's exactly right. So, and that means like you have, so because it's known, right? You have knowledge that it's in there. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And then your reasonably foreseeable hazards. What would be an example of that? Now, understanding that these are hazards that can potentially be introduced with the process of the facility or the food itself.
That could be the packaging.
Yeah, unintentionally. Yeah, again, the packages in there. Yeah, that is correct. Yeah. But there's some other unforeseeable hazards too, right? That we can think of that, it could be if you have a grinding process, right? If you have metal on metal, like there's a potential for metal being a reasonably foreseeable hazard that could be in that product. So those are some of the things to kind of think of. And then you must be able to identify, these hazards. Some of these hazards are naturally occurring, right? It could be a part of the product. For example, like microbes, right? I see someone in the chat right there. Aflatoxin, that's exactly correct. I was about to say that next. That is exactly correct. Your mycotoxins, and you can have unintentional hazards. So it could be an allergen cross-contamination. That's one way if you do not follow your due process to mitigate or minimize the potential for cross-contamination with your allergens. And then you have the intentional adulteration hazards, right? And this is strictly for economic gain, but with the intent to hurt somebody, right? And that's where, that's where our processes also, we need to make sure we show up our processes. And these types of hazards, they could either be an act of terrorism, they could be a disgruntled employee, or it could be just someone who's economically motivated to make money, but still cause a food safety harm for people, right? The intelligence community and FDA, they've identified, like I mentioned earlier in the slide, that inside attackers are a severe threat to the food supply, right? Because if you think about it, your employees have access. They know where everything is stored. They know they know where your weaknesses are, where your strengths are. They know how to bypass your systems. So there's no greater threat in your food supply, in your food safety processes than actually the internal associates. So that's why it's always critical to make sure we train, we supervise, we monitor, and we also secure our processes. Any questions so far on these two slides? Okay. So here are some examples, right? There are a few examples. There's a lot of examples, and I know there's, I follow some of the food concerns in Nigeria as well. I know Nigeria's had its fair share, but this is just some examples of, just people, internal associates, just going out of their way to intentionally contaminate the product. You have nicotine poisoning in a beef processing operation in Michigan. Literally, caused a lot of harm, and it caused the beef product to be recalled. The one in the middle, this one literally took dirt or sand from the parking lot. I was literally adding that to the chicken, the product that was actually being processed for sale in commerce, right? And then also the baby food threat with a deadly poison ricin. And again, these are babies, these are children that are being fed this product. And fortunately, I think the babies got sick, but there are no deaths. But these are just some examples of some, and I'm sure there are a lot more examples. Any questions about these? Or, can someone share maybe a couple of examples that you all have heard about with intentional adulteration in Nigeria? Anyone? I think rhino rice is usually one that comes up.
Hello, let's respond. Let's make it more interactive, please.
Don't be shy. I don't bite. I promise. I'm on the laptop. I can't bite anyone. I see a hand raised. Please go ahead, Emmanuel. Are you speaking? I can't hear you. I think you're muted. Okay. Yes, this slide will be shared. I think that this session is recorded and it will be shared afterwards. Emmanuel, I can't hear if you're saying anything, but I see your hand is raised. Come back.
So I can give an EU example. That would be the sale of horse meat instead of beef meat. So.
Yeah, that's more food fraud. That's more food fraud than food defense. So I think did people get sick from the horse meat? It's
no.
Gross, absolutely. But thanks for sharing that. I appreciate that. So design a food defense plan, right? So these are the steps that FDA has outlined in how to design a food defense plan. You want to perform a written assessment. You need to determine the mitigation strategies for the risk that you've assessed. You need to determine actionable process steps that you can implement to mitigate the strategies. You need to monitor your facility's mitigation strategies on a frequent, routine basis. You need to assign corrective actions. You need to keep your records, because if it's not recorded, it never happened. And then you need to reassess or conduct a reassessment on a regular basis. And we'll go through the steps, step by step. So your vulnerability assessment, right? The facility must conduct a vulnerability assessment for each type of food manufactured, processed, packed, or held, right? So every type of food that you process, that you pack, or that you hold, you must conduct a vulnerability assessment, right? If you're processing rice or cheese, if you're storing it, if it's a finished product that you've manufactured, you need to be able to assess that product or that process to see where are your weaknesses, right? where can this process be deviated where someone can intentionally adulterate the product? Do we have processes in place? Do we have deterrents in place? Do we have barriers in place to actually make it hard? It's never going to be 100% proof, but what you want to do, like we say, is you want to keep an honest criminal honest, right? What can you do to make it hard or harder or difficult for someone to adulterate your process, right? So methods, the assessment methods that you must include the potential public health impact. So there is a severity scale that's widely used in the industry, and we'll look at that here shortly. So that severity scale kind of helps you understand, what's the likelihood of the product being contaminated, and if it does get contaminated, how risky, how critical is this adulteration going to be? So is it easy to access, and is it very critical? The degree of physical access to the product. So do you have barriers in the process? And the ability of an attacker to successfully contaminate your product. So that last piece is what I was talking about. How do you keep an honest criminal honest, right? How do you make it difficult for people on the inside or people on the outside to potentially contaminate your process? You have to make sure you address all of those things. Again, the inside attack is your greatest threat to your food safety program. So your assessment should not be a one-man show, right? Again, I always say food safety is everyone's job, and so should a vulnerability assessment should be everyone's job. You should have a team, you should have a task force, right? Because if it's just your perspective, if it's just your vision, it's going to be very narrow, right? You want everyone's perspective because everyone's experiences are different. Everyone does different things. Everyone accesses different areas of the facility, right? Inside, outside. So you want to make sure you have a complete task force. And that task force should include from your general employees all the way to your leadership. Some of the questions you want to definitely ask is like, who might attack us? Will our threats be internal or external? How can they do it? Where are we vulnerable? Do you have an operation where you store your finished product outside or your ingredients outside? The one that scares water is one that people don't really think about a lot. But if your water source gets contaminated, you can imagine the impact that can have in your process, right? So if you have a well, how easy is it to access the well? Is the well secured? Those kinds of questions. And then you also want to think of how can we stop them, right? How can you stop it? So, and not necessarily like physically catching the person in the act, but how can you prevent that person from actually contaminating your product? Is it locking your wells? Is it piping everything in? Is it having security guards, even cameras? I'm not a big fan of cameras, and here's the reason why I don't like cameras, right? Cameras work. So cameras are absolutely, they work. They are part of your security process, and I'm not here to negate cameras, but my only challenge with a camera is it only comes in handy after the harm's happened, right? So the damage is already done, and then the camera's telling you what the damage is, right? So I say have cameras, but also have things to actually prevent the damage from actually happening. I see there are 4 things in the chat. Okay. Does food defense have its own template like HACCP? It does. There is a vulnerability assessment chart that you can download off the internet. It looks just like a HACCP plan. Yes, it does. And you can have both, or you can incorporate that into your HACCP plan. Right, so you don't have multiple documents, or you can just have your analysis. But yes, it does have a template like a HACCP plan. Emmanuel, does HACCP plan come to play in food defense? 100%, 100%. Because depending on your risk and how exposed you are, and you might end up having the CCP. It's not common, but you can. Right, you might end up having to create a critical control point. One that people always forget is there's an ingredient called nitrite in the meat production operation, right? Nitrite, it helps preserve the product, and it helps give your meat a distinct color, right? But nitrite looks just like salt. Literally looks just like salt. But nitrite, if you put just 1 ounce more than what you're supposed to add, you can actually hurt a lot of people. So because of that, nitrite actually is a critical control point for a lot of operations here in the United States. So yes, it can impact your HACCP plan. Great question. Thank you for asking that. Okay. So again, so I talked about a risk, the severity of the risk, right? Some areas I took the liberty to actually identify some vulnerabilities. This is not an all-encompassing list, but it covers, it at least gives you an idea, gives you a jump start on where to start looking, and then build your list from there, right? Bulk ingredient receiving, loading, and storage. Again, that's one area that's heavily overlooked. You have this big silos outside, it's containing just grain, right? Corn and whatever grain you put in there, beans. Those you can't technically lock inside, they have to be outside, right? So how do you secure that? And if someone's adulterated that process or that product, how can you even tell someone's adulterated that, right? Because you're talking about 100,000 pounds or maybe more. Or maybe 1 million pounds, right? It's not feasible to inspect every ounce of that product. So your best defense there is how do you secure that? Your ingredient portioning or mixing areas where you're mixing. So I talked about nitrites, right? Nitrite looks just like salt. So you can have intentional and unintentional adulteration. If someone does not know that that's not salt, they might add too much. That's a risk, right? And if someone really knows what nitrite is, they might add too much. That's intentional adulteration, right? So with nitrite, where you start to mix ingredients like nitrites and things like that, it's a CCP where you actually have to validate and measure every single time you use that ingredient. Also with mixing points too, you can actually have someone intentionally throw something in it that doesn't belong into that process, right? So that's a risk. Where you conduct rework or add backs, that's an area, where packages or product that does not meet your specification, you bring it back to rework it. That's a potential risk. I'm sorry, was there a question? Hello? If you're not, Christian, if you're not asking questions, can you please mute? Okay. So there's a question. Can you please elaborate more on Food Fraud and Food Safety Act? Yes. So food fraud, again, food fraud is, they sound similar, but they're different, right? So food fraud is economically motivated just to make money. So you're augmenting, so horse meat is a good example, right? Say for example, if beef is too expensive and horse meat's cheaper, but to kind of like offset your cost, you incorporate that horse meat into your beef production. No one would know, you're right? And who would get hurt? Nobody, but it's still not what the customers are paying for, right? But from a Bioterrorism Act or from a Food Defense Act, you are intentionally trying to hurt people. You're intentionally trying to, potentially, the motivation is to kill people, to be honest, right? It's you want to kill people or you want to make people really sick, right? So that's the big difference. So one is just to make more money and the other is just to hurt people. Now, where they do crossovers, sometimes that food fraud can also cause harm to people, right? I think melamine was one. It's one example that everyone uses in industry where melamine, if you don't know the story, it's where this baby formula was altered, where when it's tested, it gives you an indicator that the protein is right? But actually the product actually had 0 nutrients to it and was actually causing malnourishment, and it was actually causing babies to get sick and die, right? So that was a case of food fraud that actually transitioned into a food defense.
So let me help here. Let me help here.
Go ahead.
Let me help here. So basically, in trying to distinguish food fraud and food defense, food fraud is basically portraying a food to be something that it is not, so that you can make extra money. So we gave the example of you trying to mix horse meat with beef so that you can maximize your profit.
That's right.
With food fraud, it is about maximizing profit. It's about making more money. It is about deception. When you have milk that is 1 gallon but because you want to make more money, you add an extra gallon of water and you mix it up together. So you have 2 gallons and make more money. That is food fraud. So food fraud is all about trying to deceive the customer so you can get more money from them. But with food defense is just trying to be the goalkeeper in a soccer game so that nobody scores. What does that mean? Food defense is all about making sure that nobody gets to alter the food for any reason, especially to make people sick. So with food fraud, with food defense, you are trying to make sure that the food is preserved, that nobody can intentionally do anything to alter the state of the food, primarily to prevent people from getting sick or getting killed. So that's the distinction between the two of them.
Nee, is that you? Is that Nee? Who is speaking? Who's that? Adeni, is that you?
Yeah, that's me. That's me. So debate me.
Great job. That's it. That's well said. That's exactly right. So again, there's economic gain and then there's intent to hurt people, right? So at a very basic level, that's correct. So that's the primary difference between the two. How do you secure the safety of your customer? And one is how do you actually defraud your customer? So that's essentially the difference between the two. Thank you. So you see the examples on here. One thing I want to draw your attention to is maybe you might be familiar with this chart. I like this chart. I use this chart a lot, and this chart has been very, very handy. It's a very basic chart. So like I was talking about, it talks about the likelihood of someone accessing your process and the severity of the impact if they do access your process, right? And depending on how you do how the numbers kind of pan out, you can actually identify if you have a low threat, a mid-level threat, or if you have like an exceptional amount of threat, right? So for me, my rule of thumb, the way I kind of look at this is if you look at the green, or let's start with the ones or twos, from a severity spectrum, to me, 1 or 2 means like there's no harm that could be caused, but it might actually create a poor quality experience, right? From a severity spectrum perspective. A 3 means there's a potential for injury, but not potential. You can have things like broken tooth. You can have things like, mild headache and things like that, right? No threat to death, but you can actually still be uncomfortable or ill. A 4 means there's a potential for hospitalization, right? Due to a serious health concern. And then 5 means there's a critical health concern that could actually be possible death. So that's the severity spectrum, right? And then from the likelihood or the ease of access, right? 1 or 2 means like the likelihood of access is low, right? It's not easy to access the spot, the location, or the area, or the potential, or the production operation. A 3 means there's a potential for a breach, but it's not very easy, right? It can be breached, but it's not easy. A 4 to 5 basically means that it can be accessed fairly easily, right? So when you actually do that configuration, if you get a 5 and a 5, now you're 25, like you're sitting in a critical zone. If your risk is a 1 and the severity is a 1, and it's a low threat. So that's it's a very basic tabulation that I use. And this is one that, as you assess your sites and as you identify these areas, you want to look at these areas from how easy is it to access and what's the risk to the consumer if someone does come in and adulterate our process. I see the chat's got, let's see, any questions here? So, well, what does that mean? That's tamper proof. What does that mean? I don't understand what that question is. Okay, it looks like it's been answered already, so I'll just kind of keep moving. Any questions on this slide though, or on this chart that I shared on the screen? Okay. Yeah, no questions. All right, we'll keep moving. So for the next slide, your actionable process steps, right? These are where, a significant, where your vulnerability exists, and you identify which mitigation strategies can be applied to minimize or prevent the risk, right? The individuals that should be conducting this assessment, they should be qualified individual, meaning they should have some level of education, some training, or some experience, or a combination of those, right? So, and why that's important is it's necessary for them to know where to look, how to conduct the assessment. And also for them to receive a food defense training like you all are doing today, right? So you have a training, so you have a baseline, and you have some idea of the process, you have some idea of the education, and then you can kind of like go through, right? So I do have some examples here of some mitigation strategies. Again, this is not all inclusive, but you can actually have an idea of some of these strategies, right? So screening, before you employ somebody, that's always critical, right? You want to screen them to see, is this person a good fit? Do they have a history of doing this? You'll be amazed that some people have a history of actually, causing issues where they work, right? It could be, we call them undercover associates, right? So there's that. You want to conduct that screening. You want to make sure everyone has a daily work assessment or assignment, right? So you have everyone's assigned to a task and they know what their task is and they're doing their task accordingly. Personnel identification. If it's a visitor or an employee, they need to be identified. You need to know who's who in your operation. So, and who's not shouldn't be in your plant or should be escorted, right? Restrict all your accesses, access into the plant, access into your processing area. Just make it difficult for someone to access your operation. Security monitoring. So this is video and physical. Again, video is great, but I always like to augment the video with some sort of physical resistance. That's always important. Non-employees should be accompanied through the plant, right? You shouldn't just have visitors or contractors just kind of going through your plant or your process because they don't have a vested interest in your operation. So you want to make sure that, they're being accompanied where they go and as they travel through your operation. Train your employees. Again, this food defense course, it's important for you all to share this with your associates. Train your employees, train your people. The more they know, the more they become confident in their processes. I believe in you know what you know and you don't know what you don't know, right? So let's make sure we do that. Use approved suppliers. And this is one that I even struggle in my business, where sometimes it's like they run out of salt. And you think you can just run down to the store and get some salt. So I used to work at a McDonald's, right? And when I was like, and I never understood why when we ran out of salt, the owner would not let us go down to the store and just buy salt and use it in the process. But as I kind of got into the food business and started understanding there was a food safety concern there, I understood that you only want to get your ingredients, your supplies, and your things that you use in your processes from an approved supplier who you trust, who you've audited, who you've assessed, and they have an integrity behind their processing their products, right? That enhances your confidence and enhances the safety of your product. Conduct testing in your product where you can, right? The most common is like water. Test your water on a regular cadence, every 6 months, annually, whatever the case may be. Make sure your water is potable. Make sure the water you're using to blend, to batch, to mix, to cook, that is potable water that you can use for your process, right? Outbound trucks, secure them, make sure they're locked, they're secured. And again, back up your systems, make sure you can track who's been into your computer systems. And I mean, obviously a lot of times those systems are built to do that way, but you want to make sure that feature is present, okay? And this is just suggested strategies. I'm sure there's a lot more. Can someone share with me, if there are any strategies that they know of or they can deploy to prevent or minimize access into your operations? I know there's a long list here, but I'm sure there's a lot more out there. Any feedback? Nothing? Okay. Right.
Good evening. If I may make a contribution.
I'm sorry?
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
I was asking if I can make a contribution. So we can take a look at using the visitors logbook,
yes.
Which would mark or trace the entry and exit of visitors, Two, you can, for food, for instance, in my own factory, we don't receive visitors on production day. So we might have to also extend that visitation, not on production day. So you might also extend that to maybe the second, depending on your processing line. If you don't package your product same day, you might decide that it is only on non-production days that you can have visitors. And they will be restricted to just the office area and not any other way. So even if you, in the event, you'll have to have someone coming around for maybe even the regulatory agencies for inspection, or what do you call it, schools who want to come and do, what do you call it, courtesies, or what do you call it. So you just try and avoid all those on your production days.
Yes, 100%. Thank you so much. I think that is so critical. Like people forget that, because and the one thing that's critical about logging in your contractors and even the employees is, you want to know who's been in and who's been out, right? If you don't have visibility for who's been in, then if something happens, you can't account for who might be someone that could have potentially adulterated your process, right? So that's good. So one thing I want to point out, I said it should be qualified individuals that conduct this assessment, but again, you want to have a task force, and all these mitigation strategies, once you identify these, it's important that you bring those back to the team and you all discuss as a team, right? Again, these are suggested strategies, but it's intended to do a couple of things to push the discussion, make sure everyone's having this discussion, right? Repetition is the best way for people to learn. So when you have your plant management, your plant operations, your production operations, and you guys are discussing this, what you're also doing, you're creating awareness, right? So that's always important. So awareness is always good. So that way people know, oh, wow, okay, this is something I need to look out for, or this is an area that I need to be very cognizant of. So yeah, well done. Thanks for sharing that, Olu. So your monitoring mitigation strategy should be written procedures. You want to establish or implement written procedures, including the frequency for how you perform these checks, and how you'll be monitoring your food defense strategies, right? You also want to have adequate frequencies. You want to make sure the frequency that you're actually operating off of is adequate, right? If it's an area where you feel like, maybe once a week or a daily inspection needs to be done, make sure you validate that frequency. And again, records. If it's not documented, it never happened. So always document your processes, right? And it's important to know, like, even if whatever you find, if it's good, bad, or indifferent, right? Document those. Just make sure you have a corrective action for wherever you find a deficiency in your process, right? So I just kind of have like a step-by-step step at the bottom. So each and every actionable process step must be monitored. And it must be in place to ensure that what you have from a strategy perspective is effective and it's working. It needs to be assigned to an individual to do this, right? So in this case, I'm talking multiple individuals. So it could be your buyer, it could be a receiver, supervisors, internal auditors, whoever the case may be. Just make sure you have a cross-functional discipline in how you assess this process. The frequency of a monitoring needs to be dependent on the risk, right? If the risk is major, then you want to make sure you have a higher cadence to how you actually inspect this process. So the risk should be established. Again, this is where you need to facilitate that conversation with your senior leadership. Make sure you all are having a conversation, so they also understand that, hey, this is a risk and we need to invest in this. And then verify your processes. Verify. So you want to monitor, you want to verify, you want to document these processes.
Okay.
What's seal of confidence? I'm confused. There's a question here. What does that mean? What's a seal of confidence? You mean like tamper evidence seals? Is that what you're talking about? Isiala? There's a question there, but I don't really understand what the question is, but I'll keep moving.
Yes,
I think
that's what the person is talking about. Yes, that's
tamper
correct.
evidence seals?
Got
it.
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think we'll touch up on that here a little bit. You see that customers or consumers are actually a threat as well to your food defense program. And I'll once I get to that slide, I'll touch on that a little bit. Your verification procedures, right? You must conduct activities that include, verifying the nature of your mitigation strategies, right? Review your monitoring processes. The activities reflected in your records, you want to make sure you can verify those. You want to make sure mitigation strategies are properly implemented, and you can verify that by actually just looking at how the checks are being done. And also verify that appropriate decisions were made, right? For example, if, so we're talking about this big silo outside, and you flag that as a risk. The silo is right by the express road. There's no fence, it's not locked. You can just go over there, just put a bucket under there and get your beans or your rice and walk away. You flag that as a risk, and then your senior management tells you, don't worry about it, nothing happened, right? It's not a big deal. So we need to make sure that, that conversation is had, and vice versa too. If the process is locked and secured, and you feel like there's no threat, but you're being pushed that, hey, this should be a threat, those kind of conversations, you want to verify, is this effective? Do we have a threat? And just have those conversations and make sure as a team that you all align with that. The one thing I'll strongly suggest, even with this assessment, still take yourself away from it. Look at onboarding, external auditors. Have someone who has who doesn't work at your site, and a third person per se, that can come in and evaluate your process, your operation, and your compliance, and give you that feedback. Sometimes we get jaded by looking at the same thing over and over and over again. So I'll give you an example. There was a plant that I just started managing, right? And this plant's been in existence for a long time. And they have this room that's right in the production area that has chemicals in it. It's never been locked. And I'm asking, why is this room not locked? They're like, oh, we don't lock that room. It makes it easy for us to access when we need to clean. And my question is, again, why is this room not locked? Because they're making ready-to-eat products in that area, right? So I had to kind of educate the team, like, okay, so what if they had different kinds of chemicals in there. There's nothing that will stop someone from adding a little bit of chemical into the finished product that we're selling. So what we had to do was then put that door on lock and then actually put a key card access on that door. So that way you can actually secure the process a little bit. But everyone's walked past that door every day because it's easy to access. No one wants to lock the door because you have to wait for the manager to show up and get you the keys. And if the manager's having a bad day, he might not be able to get there and open the door for you on time, right? So we need to kind of weigh those things and try to figure out how can we make this process secure, but also scalable for the process. So get an auditor, get an external person, get a separate point of view, have them come audit and assess your operation. I think you'd always benefit from that, okay? Corrective actions, so all your findings needs to be documented, right? Again, I talked about if it's good, bad, or indifferent. We need to make sure we're documenting the findings. So you must establish and implement written food defense corrective actions in your plan, right? So if a failure happens, what are you going to do? How will you correct that nonconformance, right? And then the food defense corrective action procedures must describe step-by-steps taken to correct the deviation. What step are you going to take to isolate, to remove, if it's a recall that needs to happen, or if, whatever the case may be, but you need to kind of have that process properly documented, right? So some examples of corrective action is product dispositions, right? Product disposition means like isolating, destroying product that's contaminated, reviewing your camera, notifying the regulatory authorities, like, hey, we have something, and if it's in the marketplace or whatever the case may be. Conducted employee investigations, interviews, and before you resume operations. Employee dispositions, right? It could be as simple as, terminating and escorting an employee out of the plant, limiting their access into the operation, and canceling all their access. Because sometimes if they have a key, if they have an electronic key card access, and if they leave with that, they still have access to your operation. Or maybe even your employees might not even know that they've been terminated. So that person can always come back and present a threat because now they're unhappy with your business and they might want to sabotage your business. So you want to make sure that that's properly accounted for. Public disposition, enhance your facility restrictions, put up a fence, make sure everyone coming in has access. If it's a key card access, Only people that should be in the building should be in the building. If you have non-employees, escort them, right? You should have someone who's dedicated to make sure like they are guiding and guarding that person to make sure that person is not a threat. Like Olu had mentioned, again, make sure they sign in, proper sign in, and testing of materials, and only admit authorized persons into your operation, right? So this is some things that, some of the things that from a corrective action perspective, you isolate the product, you remove the threat, and also then you fortify your operation, right? And so once you have those things, like, okay, your threat has been addressed, then you can resume your operation back afterwards. Record keeping, if it's not documented, it never happened, right? It's just that simple. And people get in trouble. You go through all these processes, you do all the right things, but you don't document them, right? Then it becomes word of mouth. Word of mouth does not help, especially when it becomes a legal matter, right? When you have to go to court, telling the judge or the lawyer that you did this on so-and-so date, but it's not documented, that's a lost battle, right? So you want to make sure you're documenting. And the one thing people always forget too is like, it helps you avoid being negligent. Negligence is a bad word, obviously, as you all know in the food industry, right? If a lawyer is trying to prove you're negligent, this is one that would show like, hey, no, we have a visitor log, we have our processes, we have all these things documented, and here's what we have in place, right? So make sure your processes are properly documented. Your general requirements for your documentation: identify the facility, name and the location, the date and the time the activity was documented, who did the checks, who verified, who conducted the monitoring activity, and identify the product, that you evaluating or that can be effective, right? But again, the key thing is make sure your records are properly well documented. They have the actual correct data. You document in real time. It's accurate. It's indelible, meaning like it's in ink, it's permanent, and it's legible, right? I can tell you when I audit plants, nothing kind of drives me nuts more than just seeing like in the illegible documentation or canceling or crossing out. Now it looks like you're falsifying your checks, right? So that always raises a lot of questions. So just make sure your documentation is proper and well done. So reasons for food defense failing, right? It's just not implementing your processes correctly, poor management practices, poor inspection practices, just not following what you've already established, or just not doing anything at all, right? So you want to make sure you fortify your process. What the right thing to do it, but it's just not your job though. It's everybody's job. Make sure your employees are trained. Make sure your managers are trained. Make sure your leadership's trained. Make sure the corporate team is aware, right? One of the things that we've done here, we've actually had where our plants are only for people that work in the plant. And when the corporate team come in, they just don't have easy access into the plant, right? They have to actually go through a formal process of training before they actually access the plant. A lot of people didn't like it, but they understood because that was part of our food defense strategy. So in summary, conduct a vulnerability assessment of your operation. I think that's always important. That's your first step. Like, find out where you're weak and figure out, okay, this is the area where we're weak. How do we shore that up? What do I need to do to make sure we enhance this process, right? Identify your focus mitigation strategies. So once you've identified those weaknesses, then start to figure out what are your mitigation strategies? What would you put in place to actually shore that up? Then establish and implement your procedures. So you've identified the strategies that you need to have. Now you have to have your procedures. How are you going to actually execute, right? And then once you've executed, once you have that established, then your corrective actions, right? So if this fails, what do I have to have in place to make sure I can correct this non-conformance back? How can I correct this deviation? So that's always important. Then verify. Verify that your process works. Verify that everything that you've put in place is effective. One thing that I always do for all of my plants is I intentionally actually try to access my plants. I've tried to figure out, okay, I've tried to go through the back doors, go through areas where people are not expecting. When I do the vulnerability assessment, I actually try to access my plants through areas that no one's actually thought about. So challenge your process, verify it, you know, and your food defense should be a part of your overall, like, you know, crisis management program, you know, so you know how to mitigate and manage crisis when it does happen. And I think with that, I think we're at the end of this session. I've got 2 minutes left. I kind of had to power through that last few slides, but what I'd like to do is take this last few minutes to actually answer any questions or any feedback that anyone has on this session. I see the chat's been busy. Okay, I see some examples. I agree. Some of these examples are really good. Environmental impact assessment should be properly structured too, 100%. Lack of GMP, that is exactly right. You know, like your GMP is your very base model to ensuring that you have a thorough food safety process. If you don't have a good GMP, then what are you doing, right? Then the rest of your processes would literally just break, right? Your GMP is a base template for you to build out your programs, you know, hand washing and ensuring that process control, that's exactly right. Again, everything's based off of a GMP. Like if you don't understand the basic GMP, or if you can't implement your basic GMP, everything else is built on top of that, right? So yes, that is correct. Any questions for me?